He had no idea he was a father, until his ex called, and he saw the baby with his eyes. The hospital room was cold, filled with the quiet hum of machines and the occasional echo of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Alexandra Blake lay still in the narrow bed, her body weak and stitched with pain. She had been there for 3 long months, 87 days of tubes, transfusions, medications, and blurred sunrises. Complications from childbirth had nearly taken her life. The delivery had been sudden and violent, a flood of pain and panic that left her unconscious before she ever got to hold her son. When she finally awoke, her world had changed in every possible way. She was a mother now, though the first time she laid eyes on Logan, her son, was through the clear wall of an incubator. Logan had been healthy from the start, thankfully. Born a little early but strong, he had dark tufts of hair and ocean blue eyes that mirrored someone Alexandra had once known too well, Cole Hatcher. She hadn't spoken his name aloud since the day she left him. He didn't know about the pregnancy. She had chosen silence, convinced that telling him would only lead to pain or rejection. She remembered every word he had said about children being a burden, a distraction from ambition. And though he had never meant to be cruel, his words had stayed with her like glass under the skin. So she left quietly, carrying a secret that grew heavier with every heartbeat. But nothing could have prepared her for the months that followed the birth. The hemorrhaging started within hours. Emergency surgery. Blood loss. Long days in and out of consciousness. And when the physical pain began to ease, the emotional weight took its place. Alexandra had no family nearby. Her parents were gone. No siblings. Friends visited at first but drifted as the weeks went on. The nurses were kind, but they weren't a shoulder to cry on when the nights were longest. She was alone, except for Logan. A nurse brought him in each morning and took him at night. Alexandra lived for those hours in between. She tried not to think of Cole. But sometimes, when Logan opened his eyes and looked at her with that same piercing shade of blue, she couldn't help it. She would remember his laugh, his ambition, his relentless work ethic, and the way he used to hold her like she was the only soft thing in a hard world. She would remember how she never felt good enough for the life he lived, and how leaving had felt like the only way to protect their son from becoming just another thing Cole couldn't make time for. But now, as she lay staring at the pale ceiling, weak from months of lying down and too many medications, Alexandra reached for the hospital phone. Her hand trembled. She didn't know what she was hoping for: help, maybe. Support. Not love. She no longer believed in that kind of rescue. Still, she dialed the number that was burned into her memory. She hadn't called him once in all these months. But she had reached the edge of herself. The exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore. It was inside her, hollowing her out. The phone rang. She expected voicemail. But he answered. His voice was just as she remembered, sharp, low, focused. He said her name slowly, like he wasn't sure he heard it right. She didn't give him time to ask questions. "I'm in the hospital," she said. "We need to talk." And then she hung up, closed her eyes, and held her breath. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hospital corridor long before Alexandra saw him. Cole Hatcher walked with the same purposeful stride she remembered, dressed in a navy suit that looked as if he'd just stepped out of a board meeting. His hair was neatly styled, dark and polished, his face unreadable, except for the way his eyes scanned every room number until they found hers. When he finally stood at the threshold of her hospital room, he hesitated for the first time. It wasn't because he was unsure if he was in the right place, it was because what he saw inside knocked the air out of his lungs. Alexandra was nothing like the woman he remembered. She looked so much smaller now, her frame fragile beneath the hospital blanket, her blonde hair limp against the pillow, her face pale and tired. Her body had clearly been through war, and it showed. But she met his gaze calmly, with no fear or apology, only quiet exhaustion. On the small table beside her lay a half-empty bottle of water, a folded blanket, and a photo. He didn't see the picture clearly at first, but it drew his attention like a magnet. Then, in the silence, a sound made him freeze. A soft cooing. He turned slightly toward the source, and there, in a bassinet nestled beside the hospital bed, lay a tiny baby, his skin still flushed with youth, his dark hair curling slightly at the edges, his tiny hands moving lazily in the air. The baby blinked up at the ceiling, then yawned, making a noise so small it seemed impossible to carry such weight. Cole stared at the child like he had never seen a baby before. Maybe, in a way, he hadn't. Not like this. He took a step inside, slowly, as if afraid he might wake from a strange dream. His voice was lower now, rougher around the edges. "Is he?" Alexandra nodded, saying nothing. There was no emotion in her expression, just simple confirmation. That one nod unraveled something inside Cole he didn't know had been wound so tightly. He didn't speak further for a while. He simply stood there, trying to process what his eyes refused to deny. The baby looked like him. He had his dark hair. His eyes, the same sharp blue he saw in the mirror every morning. "How old is he?" Cole asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 months, Alexandra replied, resting her head back against the pillow. "His name is Logan." Cole whispered the name to himself like it was a foreign word, one he had never heard but already meant everything. Logan. 3 months. That meant he had been born not long after she disappeared. His mind raced with timelines, questions, guilt. How had he not noticed she was pregnant? Why had she left without saying anything? How had she gone through this, through all of it, alone? He looked at her again. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her eyes closed briefly. "Because I didn't know if you'd care. You were clear about children. About not wanting a family." "I didn't want them then," he said carefully. "But that doesn't mean I wouldn't have, that I wouldn't have done something if I'd known." She raised an eyebrow faintly. "Would you have? Honestly?" He didn't answer, because the truth was he didn't know. He had spent years building walls around himself, dedicating everything to work, to ambition, to the idea that emotions were distractions and vulnerability was weakness. He had pushed away anything that made life unpredictable. A child? That would have terrified him. And now here he was, standing in front of one, a boy who shared his blood, who didn't ask to be hidden or born into silence. "I almost died, Cole," Alexandra said softly, her voice suddenly unsteady. "I lost so much blood. They had to operate twice. I couldn't walk for weeks. I had no one. No family. No friends who stayed. Just him. And every night, I lay here wondering if I made the right choice." That broke him more than anything. The idea that she had gone through this alone, suffering, doubting herself, while he sat comfortably in his penthouse office, unaware. He stepped closer to the bassinet, gazing down at Logan, who had now dozed off, his lips parted in peaceful sleep. "I didn't deserve to know, maybe," Cole said quietly. "But I'm here now. And I want to be part of his life. If you'll let me." Alexandra didn't respond right away. She looked at him long and hard, searching for cracks in his expression, for signs of guilt, of ego, of anything false. But all she saw was the truth. He was stunned, shaken, and very clearly moved. "I didn't call you because I needed help," she said. "I called you because I'm exhausted. And I needed someone to know he exists. Someone besides me." "That's enough," he said. "You shouldn't have had to carry this alone." He reached toward the baby slowly, then pulled back. "Can I wash your hands?" she said gently. "Then you can hold him." Cole nodded, walked to the sink, and scrubbed his hands like he was about to perform surgery. He dried them quickly, and returned, hands awkward but careful. Alexandra guided him as he picked up Logan for the first time. The baby stirred, eyes fluttering open for just a second, then nestled into Cole's chest. Everything stopped. Cole had built companies, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, walked into rooms full of power, but nothing had ever made his hands shake like this. He held his son, and for the first time in years, the world didn't feel like it needed to be controlled. It just needed to be held. Alexandra watched him. Something in her chest eased, though she didn't dare admit it yet. He was here. That didn't change the past. But it just might change everything that came next. The next morning began with a quiet rhythm, unlike any day Cole Hatcher had lived in years. He arrived at the hospital earlier than expected, without flowers, without an assistant hovering behind him, without a phone glued to his ear. He didn't tell his team where he was going. For once, the world of boardrooms and billion-dollar projections could wait. Something inside him had shifted the moment Logan rested against his chest. He hadn't known what to call it at the time, but now he recognized it for what it was, a door opening in a place he had spent his whole life keeping locked. When he entered the hospital room, Alexandra was awake and sitting upright, her tray untouched, her eyes tired but alert. Logan was in a bassinet next to the bed, lightly swaddled and squirming. Cole offered a small nod of acknowledgement, unsure if he was welcome or merely tolerated. He wasn't used to not knowing his place in a room. In business, everything was structured, there were roles, hierarchy, order. But here, in this small room with a baby whose breathing was the only sound, he was on foreign ground. "You're early," Alexandra said quietly, not unkindly. "I couldn't sleep," Cole admitted, setting a coffee on the side table and handing another to her. "I've never held a baby before yesterday." Alexandra accepted the coffee, surprised. "You seemed calm." "I was pretending. I thought I might drop him. Or break him." "You didn't." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't hostile. It was full of unspoken questions, tentative peace, and the faintest thread of understanding stretching between them. Cole sat in the chair beside the bed, close but not imposing. He looked at Logan again and then at Alexandra, who studied him more openly now. She saw the stress in his eyes, but also something she hadn't expected, sincerity. Not rehearsed empathy or corporate performance, but real uncertainty. Vulnerability in a man who'd built his life on appearing invincible. "I owe you the truth," she said suddenly, her voice steady but quiet. "About why I left the way I did." Cole didn't interrupt. He just waited, eyes focused completely on her. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. Not of being a mother, but of being one in your world. You told me once that children get in the way of purpose. That you never wanted to become your father, cold, detached, always gone. And I believed you. I believed that if I told you, you'd push me away before I could even explain. So I left first." He didn't try to deny it. "That's fair. I said those things. I meant them at the time. But hearing you say them back now, it hurts, because I didn't realize what I was pushing away until it was gone. I didn't want to raise Logan with resentment hanging over him. I didn't want to watch you show up out of guilt or obligation. I needed to believe I could do it without you. And you have," he said honestly. "You survived something that should have destroyed you. You've raised him with nothing but strength." "I didn't want to do it alone," she confessed. "But I had to." Cole swallowed hard. "I can't undo what happened. But I want to try. Not for redemption. Not because I deserve it. Just because I want to be his father. However you'll let me." She looked down at the cup in her hands, fingers tightening slightly around the warmth. "I don't know what that looks like yet, Neither do I, he said. But I'm here. And I'll keep showing up until we figure it out. They sat like that for a while, just the two of them and the soft breathing of the infant nearby. It was not a reconciliation, not a beginning, not a conclusion. It was something else, an opening. Later that day, a nurse came in to check Alexandra's vitals and Logan's feeding log. Cole stood up, giving them space, but before he stepped out, Alexandra surprised him. She turned to him, eyes clear. "Do you want to help with his bottle?" He looked stunned for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. I do." She handed him the formula, then guided him through every step, measuring, mixing, testing the temperature. She watched him fumble, his confident hands awkward with something so simple. But he listened. He asked questions. He didn't rush. When Logan drank quietly in his arms, tiny fingers clutching the fabric of Cole's shirt, something inside Alexandra shifted. This wasn't the man who had once dismissed the idea of children entirely. This was someone else, someone trying, someone present. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of quiet tension, like standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether the wind would push you forward or pull you back. Cole kept coming to the hospital. Every day. Not out of obligation or dramatic apology, but with the kind of steadiness Alexandra hadn't known he was capable of. He arrived early, brought her coffee without asking how she took it, still remembered, and held Logan like the boy was something breakable and sacred. It was strange, witnessing this new version of a man she had once loved and then taught herself to live without. Stranger still was the part of her that didn't quite know what to do with his presence. Cole didn't ask to stay overnight. He didn't overstep. He offered help when she needed it and silence when she didn't. But Alexandra could feel the questions building beneath the surface, on both sides. She avoided most of them, not ready to revisit everything she'd buried. Her body was still recovering. She was tired, deeply, constantly, from both the physical toll and the emotional weight of trying to be okay. On the fourth morning of his visits, Cole arrived to find her sitting in a wheelchair near the window, sunlight spilling over her pale skin. Logan was asleep in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers. The room felt warmer than usual, the spring air seeping in through the cracked window. She looked up at Cole as he entered and said nothing, but nodded toward the empty chair beside her. He sat down and watched them for a moment. "You look stronger today." "I feel stronger," she said, though her voice still carried that raw edge from exhaustion. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "Have the doctors said when you'll be discharged?" "Maybe in a week. They want to be sure there's no internal bleeding or infection. The surgeries took more out of me than they expected." He nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" That was the question. The one she hadn't let herself think too hard about. Her apartment was small, barely enough room for a crib and supplies, and it certainly wasn't ready for her in the fragile state she was still in. She didn't have family to call, no one waiting with open arms. Her only plan had been survival, one day at a time. "I haven't figured that part out yet," she admitted. "I'll manage." "You don't have to manage alone," he said quietly. "I meant what I said. You can come home with me." She turned to look at him, brow raised, guarded. "Your penthouse isn't exactly designed for a newborn." "I already started converting the guest room," he replied, surprising her. "Cribs assembled. Diaper stations on the way. I've read more about baby care in the past 3 days than I ever did about mergers." "You think that makes you ready?" "No," he said without hesitation. "But I want to be. I'm not trying to win you back, Alexandra. I just want to give him what I never had, a father who's actually present." That landed somewhere deep in her chest. She had always known about Cole's complicated relationship with his father. Cold. Distant. A man who'd built an empire but had never once said, "I'm proud of you." Maybe that was why Cole had spent so long convincing himself that families were burdens. Maybe he had built his emotional armor so thick that it had taken losing everything to realize it had trapped him more than it protected him. Alexandra adjusted Logan in her arms. "And what about me? What am I in that plan?" He met her gaze without blinking. "You're his mother. And you're someone I hurt. If staying near me hurts you more, I'll step back. But if there's a way I can make your life easier while you recover, I'll do it. No strings. No pressure." For a long moment, she didn't answer. She thought of the nights she had cried quietly so the nurses wouldn't hear, the moments she thought she might break from the weight of doing this alone, the fear that Logan would grow up without a father and that somehow, that would become a wound he carried forever. "I don't want to live in your world," she said softly. "I don't want to feel like a guest in your life." "You wouldn't be," he said. "I don't want to be a part-time visitor in my own son's life. I want to build something that works for all three of us." She looked down at Logan. His tiny face was relaxed in sleep, unaware of the decisions that would shape the first years of his life. "I'll come," she said, surprising even herself. "Just until I'm strong enough. After that, we'll figure it out." Cole didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded, like a man who understood the weight of being allowed back into a space he once abandoned. There was something deeply respectful in the way he accepted her terms without question. The next day, he brought a car seat. The day after that, baby clothes and postpartum supplies. Each time he showed up with something new, he asked for nothing in return. Alexandra still doubted parts of him, but she couldn't deny what she was seeing: effort. Quiet, consistent, purposeful effort. It wasn't love reborn. It wasn't some perfect fairy tale reconciliation. It was the beginning of rebuilding something real from the ruins. And sometimes, that was more powerful than starting fresh. Moving in with Cole was nothing like Alexandra had imagined. When she had agreed to it in the hospital, she pictured cold marble floors, sterile white walls, and silence thick enough to choke on. But when the elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse and she stepped inside holding Logan in her arms, she was stunned by what she saw. The space was still every bit as luxurious as she remembered, but it had changed. The once minimalist apartment now bore signs of preparation: soft rugs laid out in the living room, baby-proofing foam on sharp corners, a mobile spinning gently over a crib set up near a floor-to-ceiling window, and stacks of diapers, bottles, and baby clothes organized in neat rows along one wall. The light filtering in from the massive windows was warm, golden even. She had expected it to feel foreign, but it felt, strangely, like someone had been trying to build a home. Cole stepped in behind her with a bag over his shoulder and didn't speak at first. He let her take it in on her own terms, watching her with a careful, unreadable expression. Logan stirred in her arms but didn't wake. Alexandra walked slowly through the main space, stopping near the crib. She reached out and touched one of the tiny onesies folded on the changing table. They were the exact size. Everything was. "You did all this?" she asked finally, not turning to look at him. "I had help from a consultant," he admitted. "I didn't know where to start. But I wanted you both to feel safe here." The idea of Cole consulting a baby expert nearly made her smile, but she didn't show it. The gesture wasn't small. It was massive. And it scared her a little, how much she wanted to believe it was genuine. He showed her to the guest suite, renovated, expanded, and entirely hers. A separate nursery for Logan connected to her room by a sliding door. It was clear he had planned for more than just a temporary stay. But he didn't say that out loud, didn't pressure her to acknowledge the implications. When she asked about his bedroom, he only said, down the hall, and left it at that. He gave her space, not just physically but emotionally, which was harder. He didn't push her to talk, didn't act like they were a family, didn't pretend the past had been wiped clean. And that restraint made all the difference. The first night was awkward. Logan cried at 2 a.m., and Alexandra woke instantly, her body still weak but moving on instinct. As she fumbled with the formula in the dim light of the nursery, Cole appeared in the doorway, barefoot in sweats and a plain black t-shirt. She expected him to watch, maybe ask if she needed help. Instead, he walked over without a word and picked up the bottle parts she had dropped, assembling them quietly. He passed the finished bottle to her, then stepped back. "Thanks," she said, holding Logan against her chest as she fed him. Cole nodded. "I set up a white noise machine. I read that helps him sleep longer." She glanced over at the corner where the machine hummed softly. "You've been reading a lot." "I've been trying to understand," he said. "Him. You. All of this." It was the closest he had come to saying he regretted everything. She didn't push him for more. Over the next few days, their rhythms slowly began to align. Mornings started with coffee and baby wipes, afternoons blurred into feedings and naps, and evenings became quiet stretches of shared presence. Sometimes they sat on opposite ends of the couch while Logan slept on a playmat between them. Alexandra would read. Cole would answer a few emails on his laptop, always careful not to bring work noise into the room. There were moments of warmth, tiny flashes, a shared laugh when Logan sneezed 5 times in a row, a look of understanding when one of them managed to soothe him faster than expected. But it wasn't seamless. There were difficult moments too. Times when Alexandra snapped from exhaustion and Cole didn't know how to respond. Times when he instinctively reached for control of a situation, a schedule, a decision, and she bristled, reminding him that this wasn't a company, it was a life. But he adjusted. Slowly. And she noticed. One night, after a particularly long day of Logan refusing to nap and Alexandra nearly crying out of sheer frustration, she found Cole in the kitchen cooking. Not reheating. Cooking. Something with vegetables and real spices. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You cook now?" she asked, a mix of sarcasm and disbelief in her voice. "I learned," he said without turning. "You haven't been eating much. I figured I'd try something better than delivery." She didn't respond, but she stayed. She sat at the island while he finished sautéing vegetables and plating the chicken. When he finally set a plate in front of her, she looked at it as if it were a peace offering. And maybe it was. After a few bites, she glanced up at him. "You're different." He didn't look surprised. "So are you." "Not just because I had a baby." "No," he said. "Because you did it all alone. And survived." She wasn't sure whether to thank him or cry. Instead, she kept eating. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Logan's even breathing from the bassinet next door, she thought about how strange life was. How the man who had once seemed like a stranger even in their relationship was now slowly becoming someone she didn't hate being around. She didn't trust it yet, but she saw the edges of something honest forming between them. Maybe, just maybe, they were both becoming people they never imagined they could be. And maybe that was the first step towards something that didn't just look like a family from the outside, but felt like one from within. Cole was not used to slowing down. His life had always moved in carefully measured minutes, each second accounted for by meetings, contracts, deadlines, and control. But life with a newborn shattered every sense of structure he had ever known. It wasn't just the lack of sleep or the unpredictability, it was the vulnerability, the sheer emotional intensity of every moment. For the first time in his adult life, he couldn't fix something with a phone call or a strategic decision. If Logan cried, he had to figure out what the cry meant. If Alexandra was quiet, he had to resist the urge to solve her silence. He had to learn to be present. And that, more than anything, began to change him. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Alexandra and Logan moved in. The nights were still broken, but Cole had begun to adapt. He started to anticipate Logan's cues, the way he clenched his tiny fists just before he got hungry, the soft whimper that meant he wanted to be held, the sighs he made when falling asleep in the crook of someone's arm. Cole even downloaded an app to track feeding and sleeping schedules, though half the time Alexandra teased him for relying on data like Logan was a business forecast. Still, she didn't stop him. She let him help. She let him learn. Their dynamic remained complicated. Alexandra didn't speak much about the past. She rarely mentioned the pregnancy or the first terrifying weeks in the hospital, and she never asked Cole where his mind had been during those months. Part of her didn't want to know. Part of her was afraid she already did. But the longer they lived under the same roof, the more she saw in him that didn't match the man she had walked away from. There was a softness in the way he touched Logan's head now, a patience in how he listened to her instructions without correcting or controlling her. She had expected him to become distant once the novelty wore off. But he didn't. He stayed. Quietly. Consistently. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the windows and Logan napped in his bassinet, Alexandra sat curled on the sofa with a sketchpad in her lap. She hadn't drawn in months. Her hands felt stiff at first, her lines uncertain. But as she began to shape the outline of Logan's face, her breath slowed, and the outside world faded. Across the room, Cole watched her from the kitchen, not wanting to interrupt. She looked different when she drew, still tired, still fragile, but peaceful. For the first time since he'd known her, she wasn't trying to be strong. She just was. After a while, he walked over and sat beside her, careful not to jostle the sketchpad. "You're really good." "I used to do this all the time," she replied without looking up. "Stopped when I got too exhausted to hold a pencil." "Why didn't I know that about you?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Because we never talked about anything real," she said, and though her voice was calm, the words hit hard. "We talked about work. Schedules. Deadlines. We didn't talk about dreams." Cole didn't defend himself. He didn't try to reframe the past. He nodded because it was true. He had never asked. He had never created space for her to show him who she really was outside of their neatly timed lives. Later that evening, Logan refused to sleep. He cried for over an hour, despite being fed, changed, and rocked. Alexandra, drained and on the edge of tears herself, finally handed him to Cole. "You try. He doesn't want me right now." Cole took Logan gently and walked with him through the apartment, humming quietly, then talking to him like he might to a friend. He told him about the city skyline and the color of the sky when it rained. He told him about the first time he met his mother and how terrified he had been that someone like her might actually love someone like him. After 20 minutes, Logan began to settle, his tiny eyelids fluttering. Cole didn't stop talking. He told him stories of childhood, mostly sad, some funny, stories he'd never told anyone, not even Alexandra. When the baby finally fell asleep, Cole stood in the middle of the hallway, staring down at him. He didn't realize Alexandra had been listening until she appeared behind him. She hadn't said anything at first, letting the quiet settle. Then she whispered, "He knows your voice now." Cole looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't think I'd be good at this." "You're not perfect," she said softly. "But neither am I." That night, she invited him to stay in the nursery with her. Not in the same bed, not as partners. But as two parents watching over their son. They lay on separate couches with Logan between them, breathing in rhythm, wrapped in a silence that no longer felt strained. The distance between them was still there, built from history and wounds and choices. But now, something else existed too: respect, presence, and the slow, careful beginning of something new. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first quiet flicker of it, rising like light through the dark. The days began to pass not in sharp, disjointed pieces but in a rhythm that started to resemble life, ordinary, flawed, unpredictable, but real. Alexandra woke up before Logan most mornings now. Her strength was returning. Her body, though still tender and healing, moved with more certainty. She no longer winced every time she stood, and she had started taking short walks on the terrace, sometimes alone, sometimes with Cole beside her, neither of them saying much but both aware that silence had become its own kind of conversation. Cole had begun working from home more often. He set up a small workspace in the corner of the living room, close enough to hear Logan if he cried but far enough to stay out of Alexandra's way. It was strange seeing him so far removed from the empire he used to control like a machine. He still took calls, still checked his inbox obsessively, but there was a difference. He didn't disappear into his work anymore. He paused. He listened. He showed up. One morning, while Alexandra was feeding Logan, Cole entered the room holding 2 mugs of tea. He offered one to her without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his briefly. It was nothing. It was everything. They sat together, Logan cradled against her chest, while the city buzzed quietly beyond the windows. After a few sips, Cole spoke, his voice low. "Do you remember the night you left?" She nodded, unsure where he was going. "I came home late. You were already asleep. At least, I thought you were. There was a note on the kitchen counter. You didn't even sign it." "I didn't know what to say," she replied, her voice just above a whisper. "I didn't deserve a letter," he admitted. "But I stayed up all night staring at it, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. And it wasn't just one thing. It was everything I didn't see. Everything I didn't ask. I didn't want to be one more thing you managed," she said. "You had this life that looked so perfect from the outside. I didn't want to mess it up." "You never messed anything up," he said. "I just never made space for you to be in it." The words didn't erase what had happened. But they mattered. They hung in the air between them like a truth finally spoken. That afternoon, they took Logan outside for the first time. Just a short walk through the private garden atop Cole's building, but it felt monumental. Logan blinked up at the sky, his eyes wide with wonder, his tiny hands reaching toward sunlight like he could grab it. Alexandra watched him with awe. Cole watched both of them. "I've missed so much," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "You're here now," she said. "He doesn't know what you missed. He only knows who's holding him now." That night, after Logan fell asleep early, they sat on the couch and watched an old movie on low volume. Alexandra rested her head against the armrest, legs curled beneath her, a blanket draped over her lap. Cole sat at the other end, trying not to stare, but failing. At one point, she looked over and caught him watching her. He didn't look away. "What is it?" she asked. "I keep wondering what would have happened if I had said something different that night. If I'd told you I was scared. That I loved you." "You didn't know," she said. "And maybe I didn't either." "I know now," he said. The silence between them was charged, but not dangerous. It was full of possibility. Alexandra looked down, her fingers playing with the edge of the blanket. "I don't know what this is," she admitted. "Or what it should be." "It doesn't have to be anything yet," he replied. "I'm not asking for anything you can't give. I just want to stay close. To both of you. And maybe, if one day that turns into more, good. But if not, I'll still be here." She exhaled slowly, letting the honesty sink in. In the middle of the night, Logan cried softly. Alexandra was slow to rise, her body aching from the long day. Before she could move, Cole was already up, already in the nursery. She watched from the doorway as he picked up their son, whispering something she couldn't quite hear. Logan calmed almost immediately, his small body settling into the curve of Cole's shoulder. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, heart full of something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Safety. Not just for her, but for her child. For all the pain and mess it had taken to get here, there was something sacred about the moment unfolding in front of her. The man she had once feared would never understand what love truly meant was now rocking their son back to sleep in the soft glow of a nursery he had built with his own hands. Maybe love wasn't loud. Maybe it didn't come with declarations and fireworks. Maybe it looked like this. Quiet. Steady. Earned. The weeks turned to months, and what had started as an arrangement born from necessity became something more layered and difficult to define. Logan was now nearly 6 months old, a chubby, bright-eyed little boy who laughed often and cried rarely. His favorite place was still in someone's arms, and more often than not, those arms belonged to Cole. Alexandra watched as her son reached for him with a kind of ease that made her heart ache. Logan didn't just know Cole. He trusted him. And so, slowly, did she. Life settled into something resembling normal. It wasn't the kind of perfect normal people post about or plan for. It was real. Some mornings were rushed and chaotic, full of spilled formula and missed emails. Other days were slow and quiet, filled with shared glances and the kind of peace that only comes when nothing dramatic needs to be said. Alexandra found herself letting Cole in, piece by piece. She started telling him about things that had nothing to do with Logan, her drawings, her memories, her fears. And Cole, in return, offered parts of himself that no one else had ever seen. He told her about his mother, who left when he was 7. He spoke about the pressure he had lived under, the endless need to prove himself, and how somewhere along the way he decided that vulnerability was weakness. But holding his son had dismantled that belief more quickly and completely than anything else ever had. One quiet evening, the three of them were in the living room. Logan was asleep in his crib down the hall, and the apartment was blanketed in a kind of hush that felt heavier than usual, as if something important was about to be said. Alexandra sat on the couch in leggings and a sweater, her hair up in a loose knot, no makeup, exhaustion softening her expression. Cole was across from her, barefoot, his sleeves rolled up, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked more like a man at home than a CEO, and maybe for the first time in his life, he truly was. She was the one who broke the silence. "You've changed." He looked over at her, one eyebrow raised. "For the better?" "For the real," she answered. He smiled, just barely. "I didn't know what I was missing. I thought I had everything, and I didn't realize it was all noise. You and Logan, this is quiet. And it's the only thing that actually feels like peace." She swallowed hard, not because she was afraid, but because her body was still trying to catch up with her heart. She had never thought she would feel something like this again. Certainly not with him. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "I'm still figuring out who I am now." "So am I," he said. "But I know what I want." He stood up and walked toward the cabinet near the window. From a drawer, he pulled out a small box, not velvet, not traditional. Just simple, gray, and clean. He walked back and sat in front of her, placing the box in her hand. Her breath caught, but she didn't open it right away. "This isn't a proposal," he said. "It's a promise. That I'm not going anywhere. That I'll show up, every day. That you'll never have to wonder if I'm all in." She opened the box slowly. Inside was a delicate gold chain with a small charm, Logan's birthstone on one side, and on the other, a tiny engraving, "The day we became 3." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She wasn't someone who cried easily anymore, but something about the simplicity of the gesture broke through every defense she had built. "I don't need a fairy tale," she whispered. "I'm not offering one," he replied. "Just us. As we are. No performances. No promises I can't keep." She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "Then yes." They stayed like that for a while, in the quiet, letting the moment breathe. No one needed to define it further. Later that night, she placed the necklace on her dresser and checked on Logan, who stirred briefly in his crib and then settled back to sleep. She watched him for a while, then turned off the light and returned to the living room. Cole was still there, waiting, not asking anything more from her than what she was ready to give. And in that simple stillness, surrounded by a life they had never planned but slowly learned to choose, she realized they weren't just rebuilding something broken. They were building something new. Something born from pain, shaped by growth, and anchored in the one thing that had once seemed impossible to them both. Home. The beauty of this story lies in its emotional honesty and the quiet strength of its redemption. It's not about sweeping gestures or instant forgiveness, but about the slow, often painful process of earning trust back, not with words, but with presence, patience, and consistency. Cole's transformation isn't sudden or perfect, it's layered, raw, and deeply human. He doesn't return to fix things, he returns to grow into the man he should have been from the start. And that, more than anything, makes his change believable. Alexandra's journey is equally powerful. She doesn't fold under the weight of love reborn, she stands firmly in her boundaries, her pain, and her progress. She lets him in not because she needs saving, but because she sees that he has changed and because she herself is ready to reopen the door. That distinction matters. Her strength is not in forgiveness alone, but in choosing love without forgetting what it cost her. The ending works because it honors the mess that came before it. It doesn't pretend the past didn't happen. It shows that sometimes, healing doesn't mean returning to what was, it means creating something new from the pieces left behind. The story doesn't promise perfection. It offers something better, two people willing to fight for peace, family, and the love they once almost lost. And that makes the ending not just satisfying, but earned.